Hey guys, tonight we begin with a ruin. One of the most iconic buildings of the ancient world, the Colosseum of Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, it wasn't the half-broken tourist magnet we see today. If you stand in the right spot in Rome, at the right hour, when the tour buses have thinned out and the light has gone long and orange over the Palatine Hill, you can see something that most of the 6 million people who visit the Colosseum every year walk right past without noticing. The building is not whole. Not whole, in the sense that it's old and worn and missing a few decorative flourishes here and there. Every ancient ruin is missing something. This is different. This is structural. This is fundamental. If you walk around the entire outer perimeter of the Colosseum, slowly, the way you'd walk around a house you were thinking of buying, you will notice that one side of it rises in 4 full, towering tiers of arches, stacked stones standing 80 feet in the air, casting the same shadow it cast when gladiators walked beneath it 2,000 years ago. And the other side does not. The other side is gone. Not gone in the way that a roof is gone, or a floor is gone. Gone in the way that a jaw is missing from a skull. What remains on that side is a lower, rougher, more broken wall. The inner core of the structure, stripped of its outer skin, standing at barely half the height of its twin across the arena. It looks less like architecture and more like a cross-section. Like someone took a knife to a birthday cake and only ate the half they liked, leaving the frosted, finished side sitting untouched next to a hollowed-out ruin. For a long time, most visitors assume this is simply what happens to old buildings. Time erodes things. Empires fall, wars pass through, and stone crumbles under 2,000 years of rain and heat and neglect. That is a comfortable story, and it is not entirely wrong, but it is nowhere close to the whole truth. Because if erosion and time were the real explanation, the damage would be roughly even. 2,000 years of the same sun and the same rain fell on both sides of this building equally. The north side did not get some special protection from the weather that the south side didn't. Something else happened here. Something specific, something violent, and, perhaps more unsettling, something deliberate. The truth involves an earthquake that arrived almost exactly 1,000 years after the building was finished. It involves a pope who signed a piece of paper that turned one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history into a hardware store. It involves teams of men with carts and chisels, hauling away marble by the wagon load to build churches and palaces that still stand in Rome today. Buildings tourists photograph without any idea that the stone under their feet once held 80,000 roaring spectators. And it involves the quiet, patient scavenging of nearly every piece of metal driven into that stone, leaving behind thousands of small pockmarked wounds across the surviving walls that are still visible if you know to look for them. This is the story of what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum, and by the end of it, you will never be able to look at a photograph of that lopsided silhouette the same way again. But to understand what was taken, we first have to understand what was there. Because the story of the Colosseum's destruction only makes sense once you understand just how staggering an achievement it was to build in the first place, and just how long the Romans intended it to last. Construction began in the year 72, under the Emperor Vespasian, on a patch of land in the heart of Rome that had previously been occupied by an enormous private lake. Part of the sprawling palace complex built by the Emperor Nero, a man so widely despised by the time of his death that Vespasian's decision to drain Nero's private lake and build a public entertainment venue in its place was itself a kind of political statement. Where one tyrant had built a pleasure garden for himself, the new dynasty would build something for the people of Rome. The message embedded in the very foundations was, "We are not like him." The engineering required to make this vision real was, by any honest measure, staggering for its time. The Colosseum's oval footprint covers roughly 6 acres. Its outer wall, when complete, rose 4 stories and approximately 157 feet into the Roman sky. For context, that is taller than a modern 15-story building, built without steel, without powered cranes, without any of the tools a modern construction crew would consider non-negotiable. It was built almost entirely from travertine limestone, quarried some 20 miles away near the town of Tivoli, cut into blocks so massive that some of the largest pieces weighed several tons apiece, and then hauled across the Italian countryside on wagons pulled by oxen, along a purpose-built road constructed specifically to move this stone into the city. Once the blocks arrived, they were not simply stacked and mortared like an ordinary wall. The engineers who designed the Colosseum used a system of iron clamps, metal brackets shaped like a stylized letter H or a large staple, set into carved channels between adjacent stone blocks, and then the surrounding cavity was sealed with molten lead poured directly into the gap. It's worth pausing on that, because it tells you something important about how this building was meant to be used, and how long it was meant to last. The lead-sealed iron clamp is not a decorative flourish. It is a seismic reinforcement technique. The Romans building the Colosseum understood that Italy sits on unstable, earthquake-prone ground, and they engineered around that reality nearly 2,000 years before modern seismologists would formalize the science behind why it mattered. Estimates suggest that somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 tons of iron were used to bind the Colosseum's stones together, clamps holding the entire outer ring in a kind of metallic embrace, distributing stress across the structure so that even under the strain of an earthquake, the building would flex rather than shatter. Inside that reinforced shell, the Romans built something closer to a piece of theatrical machinery than a static building. Beneath the wooden arena floor, which was covered in sand, and the Latin word for sand, arena, is where we get the word arena in the first place, lay a two-level underground network called the hypogeum. This was a labyrinth of tunnels, holding pins, and elevator shafts, where animals and performers waited before being hauled up to the surface through trapdoors using a system of pulleys, counterweights, and human-powered winches. Historians have identified the remains of at least 28 of these lift shafts. In effect, before the show even began, an unseen army of stagehands, slaves, and engineers was operating what amounted to an ancient special effects department, capable of making a leopard appear to materialize from nowhere in front of a crowd that had no idea what mechanism made it possible. Above ground, the building could seat somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people, depending on the event, and the crowd flow engineering built into it still impresses modern stadium architects. The Colosseum had 80 numbered entrances around its perimeter, 76 for ordinary ticket holders, plus 4 grand entrances reserved for dignitaries and the emperor himself, and a system of vaulted corridors and staircases, called vomitoria, engineered so that the entire venue could be filled or emptied of tens of thousands of people in a matter of minutes. Modern stadium designers still study this system as one of the earliest and most effective examples of mass crowd management ever built. Every ticket, it's believed, corresponded to a specific numbered entrance and a specific section, not unlike the seat number printed on a ticket stub today. And then there was the roof, or rather, the awning, since the Colosseum had no permanent roof over its seating bowl. Instead, a massive retractable canvas covering called the velarium could be deployed over sections of the crowd to provide shade, operated by a dedicated team of sailors from the Roman Navy, stationed specifically for this purpose because of their expertise in rigging and rope work. A network of masts, projecting from the top of the outer wall. You can still see the stone brackets that held them, on the surviving side of the building, supported a web of ropes and pulleys capable of shifting enormous sections of fabric across an open-air space larger than a modern football stadium, entirely by hand. When it was finished, in the year 80, under Vespasian's son Titus, the opening games are said to have run for 100 days. Wild animals were brought from across the empire's furthest reaches, lions from North Africa, bears from the German forests, and, if the ancient sources are to be believed, even elephants and rhinoceroses, to be paraded, hunted, and displayed in front of a Roman public that had never seen most of these creatures in their lives. Gladiators fought. Mock naval battles were staged in the arena, flooded with water through an aqueduct connection, at least in the venue's earliest years before the hypogeum was fully built out beneath the floor. It was, by any measure available to the people who built it, meant to be permanent, meant to outlast the dynasty that built it, meant, perhaps, to outlast Rome itself. And for a remarkably long time, it did exactly that. The Colosseum hosted gladiatorial combat for roughly 400 years, animal hunts for closer to 500. It survived the slow transformation of the Roman Empire from a pagan state into a Christian one. It survived the empire's political center of gravity, shifting east to Constantinople. It survived barbarian incursions into Italy and the eventual, undignified end of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476, when the child emperor Romulus Augustulus was quietly deposed and nobody in Rome even bothered to appoint a replacement. The building outlived the civilization that built it. That much is true, and it's the part of the story most people already know, in some vague, half-remembered way, from school. What most people don't know is what happened next. Because outliving Rome did not mean escaping unscathed. It meant something almost the opposite. It meant the Colosseum's fate was no longer tied to emperors and games and imperial glory. It was tied to something much slower, much quieter, and in its own way, far more dangerous. Centuries of neglect, followed by generations of Romans who looked at the largest amphitheater ever built and saw, not a monument to be preserved, but a resource to be used. That transition, from sacred wonder of the ancient world to open-air quarry for a medieval and Renaissance city desperate for stone, did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, unevenly, across nearly 1,000 years, shaped by earthquakes the Romans could never have fully engineered against, by economic desperation, and eventually by decisions made in marble-floored papal offices far from the arena floor itself. To understand how a 15-story stone amphitheater, bound together by 300 tons of Roman ironwork, lost half of its own body, we need to follow it through the long, quiet centuries after the crowd stopped coming, and watch, piece by piece, how the world around it began, slowly and then all at once, to take it apart. Before we can talk about what was lost, it's worth spending a little more time inside the building the way it actually functioned, because the sheer scale of what once stood on that southern side is easy to say and hard to actually picture. Numbers like 157 feet and 80,000 seats tend to slide past us. So let's slow down and walk through the Colosseum as a Roman of the 2nd century might have experienced it, because that's the only way to understand what kind of hole was left when half of it came down 1,000 years later. Imagine arriving in Rome on the morning of a games day. You are not wealthy, but you are a citizen, and that matters here. Citizenship in the Roman world came with certain entitlements, and free access to public spectacle was one of the more literal ones. Your ticket, if we can even call it that, is a small carved bone or ceramic token called a tessera, and stamped into its surface is a number. That number corresponds to one of the amphitheater's 80 numbered arched entrances, and within that, to a specific tier, a specific wedge-shaped section called a cuneus, and even a specific row. You approached the building from a distance, across the open plaza that once separated it from the rest of the city, and even from far away it dominates the skyline in a way that nothing around it can compete with. It is faced, at this point in its life, entirely in gleaming white travertine limestone, not the sun-bleached, grayish, pitted stone we associate with ruins today, but freshly quarried, close to white, catching the Mediterranean sun and throwing it back at you. Historians estimate the building required somewhere in the range of 100,000 cubic meters of travertine to construct the outer facade and structural core alone, an amount of quarried stone that some modern engineering estimates suggest would fill dozens of Olympic swimming pools. The facade itself is organized with a discipline that Roman architects clearly took seriously as a statement of order and hierarchy, not just structural necessity. Each of the first 3 levels is defined by a row of 80 arches, and each arch is flanked by a half column in one of the 3 classical architectural orders, stacked in ascending sequence from bottom to top. Doric on the ground floor, the simplest and sturdiest of the classical styles. Ionic on the 2nd level, slightly more ornate. Corinthian on the 3rd, the most decorative order in the classical vocabulary. Its capitals carved with acanthus leaves. This wasn't accidental. Roman architects across the empire used this ascending sequence, simple to ornate, sturdy to refined, as a kind of visual grammar, and applying it to the Colosseum sent a clear message. This building was not simply large. It was correct. It followed the rules of proper architecture all the way up its face. 3 stacked orders in perfect classical sequence, a textbook example built at a scale nobody had attempted before. Above those 3 arcaded levels sat a 4th story, different in character from the ones below it. Not arched, but a solid wall broken by small rectangular window openings, decorated with flat pilasters rather than freestanding columns. It was in this top level that the sockets and stone brackets for the velarium's support masts were built directly into the structure. 240 of them, evenly spaced around the entire circumference, each one designed to hold a wooden mast that could be raised or lowered as needed. On a hot day in Rome, sailors from the imperial fleet at Misenum, men trained specifically for this kind of complex rope and canvas rigging, would work in coordinated teams to draw the awning across sections of the crowd, shielding tens of thousands of spectators from direct sun using nothing but rope, canvas, and choreographed manpower. Passing beneath one of the ground-level arches, you'd find yourself inside a network of radiating and concentric corridors called ambulacra, built specifically to move enormous volumes of people efficiently. The same underlying logic that governs the design of modern sports stadiums worked out here, in stone, 2,000 years earlier. Staircases branch off these corridors at regular intervals, leading up through the building's interior toward your specific seating tier, and the entire system was engineered so well that historians studying Roman crowdflow architecture have calculated the Colosseum could likely be filled to capacity in somewhere around 15 minutes, and evacuated in a similar span. Numbers that would be respectable for a modern stadium, let alone one built without any powered technology at all. Your seat itself would depend heavily on who you were. The Colosseum's interior seating, called the cavea, was divided into strict social tiers, and Roman society's obsession with visible hierarchy was written directly into the architecture. Closest to the arena floor sat a low platform called the podium, reserved for senators, the imperial family, and the emperor himself, protected from the animals and combatants below by a tall parapet wall, and, in some reconstructions, a system of netting or rollers designed to prevent leaping predators from reaching the crowd. Above the podium sat the Menianum Primum, reserved for the equestrian class, Rome's wealthy business and administrative elite. Above that, the Menianum Secundum, further subdivided into an upper and lower section for ordinary citizens, arranged by wealth and status even within that broader category. And at the very top, standing rather than seated, in a wooden gallery under the shadow of the fourth-story wall, was space reserved for the poorest citizens and, according to most historical reconstructions, for women, who were largely barred from the better seating regardless of their own family's wealth or status. The arena floor itself, the part visitors today see as an exposed maze of low stone walls and channels, was originally covered by a wooden floor laid across the top of the hypogeum and covered in sand. That sand served a grim practical purpose, absorbing blood so the footing of gladiators and animals wouldn't become treacherously slick during a fight. And it's worth noting, if only because it's a detail that speaks to how thoroughly Roman engineers thought, through even the unpleasant logistics of the spectacle, that the sand could reportedly be dyed on occasion, historians believe, to disguise bloodstains and keep the visual spectacle sharp for the crowd above. Below that wooden floor, the hypogeum ran nearly the full length and width of the arena in two underground stories, a dense warren of holding cells, storage rooms, and mechanical lift shafts. Animals brought from across the empire, and the ancient sources describing the opening games under Titus claim thousands of animals were killed across the 100 days of celebration, a figure modern historians treat with appropriate skepticism, but which nonetheless reflects the genuine scale the Romans associated with the spectacle, would be held in these underground pens until it was their moment to appear. A system of counterweight lift cages, worked by teams of men turning capstans below ground, could raise a caged animal or a costumed performer up through a trapdoor and directly onto the arena floor, seemingly from nowhere, in front of tens of thousands of spectators who had no visibility into the machinery making it happen. It was theater in the most literal architectural sense, a stage with a fully functional understage, built in solid stone, designed to produce illusion at a scale nobody in the ancient world had attempted before. All of this, the three-tiered classical facade, the velarium and its 240 masts, the numbered entrances and internally logical seating hierarchy, the underground machine of trapdoors and lift shafts, existed within a structural shell held together, as we discussed, by roughly 300 tons of iron clamps sealed in molten lead. And this detail matters more than it might initially seem to, because it explains something crucial about what the Colosseum's builders were actually trying to accomplish. They were not simply building the largest amphitheater the world had ever seen. They were building it to survive the one force that had toppled ancient structures across the Mediterranean for centuries before them: the shifting, unstable ground beneath the Italian peninsula itself. Italy sits along one of the most seismically active zones in Europe, where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates grind against each other, producing earthquakes that have shaped the region's history since long before Rome existed. Roman engineers, whatever formal understanding of plate tectonics they lacked, understood empirically, through centuries of accumulated building experience, that rigid stone structures without reinforcement tended to crack and collapse under seismic stress, while structures bound together with flexible metal connections could absorb and redistribute that stress instead. The iron and lead clamp system woven through the Colosseum's entire outer ring was, in effect, an ancient seismic retrofit built directly into the original design, an acknowledgement, baked into the architecture itself, that the ground beneath this magnificent building could not entirely be trusted. It's a strange thing to sit with. The Romans who built the Colosseum anticipated the very force that would eventually help bring half of it down. They engineered against it as thoroughly as their technology allowed, and for a remarkably long stretch of history, the better part of 1,000 years, their engineering held. It held through the fall of the empire that built it. It held through the chaos of the early medieval centuries, through wars, through fires, through the slow transformation of Rome from an imperial capital of 1 million people into a battered, half-emptied medieval town squatting inside the ruins of its own former glory. What it could not hold through, in the end, was a specific night in the middle of the 14th century, a night we'll return to soon. But before that earthquake struck, the building had already begun a much slower, much quieter transformation, one that had nothing to do with tremors in the earth and everything to do with what happens to a monument when the civilization that built it simply disappears out from under it, leaving something enormous and expensive and no longer entirely understood sitting in the middle of a shrinking, struggling city. Not with a single dramatic collapse, with centuries of slow, creeping silence. Empires do not usually end with a single door slamming shut. They end the way a fire dies, not extinguished all at once, but starved gradually of the fuel that kept it burning, until one day someone notices the room has gone cold and nobody can quite say exactly when it happened. That's a fair description of what happened to Rome itself between the 4th and 6th centuries, and it's the essential backdrop for understanding what happened to the Colosseum once its original purpose began slipping away. The building did not simply stop being used one day. It stopped being used the way everything else in Rome stopped, piece by piece, decade by decade, as the city that surrounded it shrank around it like a tide going out. The gladiatorial games, the ones most people associate most strongly with the Colosseum, are generally understood by historians to have ended sometime in the early 5th century, likely around the year 404 or shortly after, when a shift in official Roman policy, influenced heavily by the empire's ongoing Christianization and its increasing moral discomfort with the deliberate killing of human combatants for public entertainment, brought a formal end to organized gladiator combat as state-sponsored spectacle. The animal hunts, called venations, proved considerably more durable, since they didn't carry quite the same weight of moral objection in the eyes of an increasingly Christian ruling class, and continued for roughly another century, with the last confirmed recorded animal hunt at the Colosseum dated to the year 523, staged under the authority of Anicius Maximus, a Roman senator, during the reign of the Ostrogothic King Theodoric, by which point, it's worth remembering, there was no longer a Western Roman emperor at all. Rome itself was being governed by a Germanic king ruling in the name of a distant Eastern emperor in Constantinople, a strange and telling arrangement that says everything about how far the old order had already crumbled by the time the last animal was hunted on that arena floor. After 523, the written record on the Colosseum's active use goes almost entirely quiet, and that silence is itself a historical clue. A building that once generated enough administrative paperwork, enough public announcements, enough poetry and gossip and graffiti to leave traces across centuries of Roman literature simply stops being mentioned as a functioning venue. Rome's population, meanwhile, was undergoing a collapse of almost unimaginable scale. At its imperial peak, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome is estimated to have housed somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million people, a population size the city would not see again until the 20th century. By the 6th century, following repeated wars, sieges, plagues, and the catastrophic disruption of the aqueduct system that had supplied the city's water for centuries, some historical estimates suggest Rome's population had fallen to as low as 30 or 40,000 people. A city built to hold over 1 million had shrunk to something closer to the size of a modest medieval town, rattling around inside infrastructure built for a population it could no longer imagine. Picture what that actually meant for a structure like the Colosseum. This was a building engineered for a specific, very particular kind of civic life. An urban population large enough and organized enough to fill 80,000 seats. An imperial administration wealthy enough to import wild animals from 3 continents. A military logistics network capable of supplying trained sailors just to operate a canvas awning. Strip all of that away, and what remains is an enormous, mostly empty stone shell in the middle of a city that no longer has any practical use for it. Populated by a fraction of the people it was designed to serve. Governed by authorities with neither the resources nor the cultural framework to maintain a building of this scale and purpose. And so, slowly, the Colosseum began to be repurposed, not through any single decision, but through the accumulated improvisation of ordinary people living in and around a structure too enormous to ignore and too expensive to demolish. By the early medieval period, sections of the building's covered corridors and vaulted arches had begun to be converted into small dwellings, and eventually into workshops. Archaeological evidence uncovered within the Colosseum structure, post holes, hearths, small-scale building foundations tucked into its arcades, points to blacksmiths, and later a variety of other tradespeople, setting up shop inside the arches that had once framed gleaming marble columns and imperial processions. There is evidence for lime-burning activity within the structure dating back centuries before its most infamous stone-robbing era, suggesting that even in the early medieval period, long before the major quarrying campaigns of the Renaissance, local residents had already begun quietly viewing parts of the ancient monument as a source of raw material rather than a sacred relic to be preserved untouched. By around the 9th or 10th century, historical records indicate that a fortified structure had been built into a portion of the Colosseum itself, associated at various points with powerful Roman noble families who used sections of the ancient amphitheater's massive, defensible stone shell as the foundation for their own fortified compounds during the chaotic, warlord-dominated period of medieval Roman politics, an era in which powerful families frequently fought each other for control of the city, and a structure with walls this thick and this tall made for an obvious defensive asset. Later medieval sources associate control of the Colosseum's fortified sections with the powerful Frangipane family, who are documented as having held and defended portions of the structure during the political turbulence of the 12th century, incorporating it into their broader network of family strongholds scattered across the city. Think about what that transformation actually represents. A building constructed as the single most sophisticated piece of public entertainment architecture the ancient world had ever produced, designed for spectacle, for civic ritual, for the theatrical display of imperial power to tens of thousands of ordinary Roman citizens, had, within a few centuries, become something closer to a fortress slum hybrid, home to blacksmiths and squatters and noble militias. Its once gleaming travertine facade darkened by centuries of soot and neglect, its interior, arena floor, no longer maintained, slowly filling with rubble, dirt, and encroaching vegetation. Nature, in fact, becomes one of the more strangely poetic threads running through the Colosseum's medieval history. With the building no longer maintained as an active venue, and portions of its interior essentially abandoned to the elements, plant life began establishing itself within the structure's crevices and open spaces in a way that would eventually become one of the more remarkable footnotes in the history of botanical science. Centuries later, in the 19th century, botanists cataloging the wild plant species growing within the Colosseum's ruins would document several hundred distinct species flourishing across the site, an ecosystem that had developed, undisturbed, across more than 1,000 years of the building's slow abandonment, and whose unusual biodiversity some researchers speculated might even trace back to seeds carried in the fur and dung of exotic animals imported for the ancient games taking root, centuries after the last lion had been hauled up through a trapdoor onto the sand. This, then, is the Colosseum as it existed for roughly 700 or 800 years after its final recorded games. Not destroyed, not forgotten exactly, but hollowed out, repurposed, absorbed into the improvised, patchwork survival strategies of a city that had lost the civilization capable of maintaining monuments at this scale and had not yet developed the modern instinct to preserve ancient structures purely for the sake of preserving them. To medieval Romans living among its arches, the Colosseum was not primarily a wonder of the ancient world. It was a landmark, a fortress, a workshop, a source of stone, and, increasingly, as the centuries wore on, and its original imperial associations faded from living memory, something closer to a natural feature of the city's landscape than a deliberate human construction at all. There's a telling detail here. By the medieval period, popular legend in Rome had begun attributing the Colosseum's construction not to Roman engineers and emperors, but to magic, to demons, or to the labor of enslaved supernatural forces. A folk explanation that speaks volumes about how thoroughly the building's true origins had slipped out of ordinary cultural memory, replaced by myth because the truth had simply become too distant to hold on to. And it was into this long, quiet, half-forgotten stretch of the Colosseum's existence, this centuries-long silence, broken only by blacksmiths' hammers and the occasional skirmish between noble families fighting over its fortified corners, that the ground beneath Rome finally decided to remind everyone, violently and without warning, exactly how unstable the earth beneath this ancient city had always been. That reminder arrived in the middle of the 14th century, and it arrived with a force that would do more damage to the Colosseum in a matter of seconds than the previous 800 years of slow neglect had managed to inflict. To understand why the year 1349 matters so much to the shape of the Colosseum you see today, you first have to understand something about the ground it's built on, because Rome's relationship with earthquakes did not begin in the 14th century, and it did not end there either. It's a long, recurring pattern stretching across the entire span of the city's recorded history, and the Colosseum, as one of the largest and most exposed stone structures ever raised on that ground, had been absorbing the consequences of that instability from almost the moment it was completed. Italy occupies one of the more geologically restless stretches of the European continent. The Italian peninsula sits along the boundary where the African tectonic plate is slowly, relentlessly pushing northward against the Eurasian plate, a collision that has been playing out over millions of years and continues today, producing not only the Apennine mountain range that runs down the spine of the country, but also the near-constant undercurrent of seismic activity that has shaped so much of Italian architectural and cultural history, from the eruption that buried Pompeii to the long list of medieval and Renaissance cities that had to be partially or entirely rebuilt after devastating tremors. Rome itself, while not sitting directly atop the most violently active fault lines in the country, has never been fully insulated from this instability, and the historical record contains a long list of earthquakes, of varying severity, that shook the city across the centuries following the Colosseum's construction. Ancient sources actually document seismic damage to the Colosseum surprisingly early in its life. Historical records indicate that earthquakes affected the structure on multiple occasions even during the height of the Roman Empire, requiring repairs and reinforcement work that emperors undertook as a matter of course, treating structural maintenance against seismic damage as an ordinary, expected part of keeping a building this size functional. This detail matters because it tells us the Colosseum's builders were not designing for a hypothetical, once-in-a-lifetime disaster. They were designing for a recurring feature of the landscape they had chosen to build on, which circles back to why the iron and lead clamp system running through the entire outer ring mattered so much in the first place. It wasn't decorative over-engineering. It was a direct, practical response to a threat the Romans had already experienced, repeatedly, in the decades and centuries following the building's completion. For roughly the first 1,000 years of the Colosseum's existence, that reinforcement system appears to have done its job remarkably well. Despite documented earthquakes striking the region across the imperial period and into the early medieval centuries, the outer ring of the amphitheater remained largely intact, battered, certainly, by neglect, by fires. A significant fire is recorded as having damaged the upper levels of the structure in the 3rd century, requiring substantial imperial-funded restoration. By the slow creep of unauthorized construction and repurposing described in the previous chapter, but structurally whole. The iron clamps held. The lead seals held. Whatever tremors passed beneath the city across those centuries, the Colosseum's outer wall, engineered specifically to flex and redistribute stress rather than shatter under pressure, continued to stand. But engineering designed to resist earthquakes is not the same thing as engineering immune to earthquakes, and there is an important detail that becomes more significant the longer you sit with it. By the time the 14th century arrived, the Colosseum's maintenance regime, the ongoing imperial-funded repairs, the professional oversight, the trained engineers who understood exactly how the clamp and lead reinforcement system worked and how to repair it when damaged, had not existed in any organized form for the better part of 800 years. The building that had been engineered by one of the most sophisticated construction operations in the ancient world was now, by the 14th century, effectively unmaintained infrastructure, standing in a city that had neither the resources nor, in most cases, the specialized knowledge required to properly repair damage on this scale if something went seriously wrong. And something was about to go seriously wrong. On the 6th of September, in the year 1349, a major earthquake struck the region encompassing Rome. Modern seismological analysis of historical records places the epicenter of this event in the central Apennines, likely somewhere near the area historically associated with the town of Sulmona in the Abruzzo region, a considerable distance from Rome itself, which speaks to just how powerful the underlying seismic event must have been to inflict the level of damage it did across such a wide geographic area. This wasn't an isolated tremor centered directly beneath the city. This was a major regional earthquake, likely somewhere in the range of magnitude 6 or higher based on modern reconstructions of the damage patterns described in surviving historical accounts, radiating destructive force outward across a significant portion of central Italy. The timing of this earthquake places it squarely within one of the darkest and most catastrophic periods in the entire history of medieval Europe. The year 1349 falls directly in the midst of the Black Death, the devastating plague pandemic that swept across Europe beginning in 1347 and is estimated by modern historians to have killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of the continent within just a few catastrophic years. Rome itself was suffering severely under the plague's advance at exactly the moment the earthquake struck, meaning the city's already diminished, already traumatized population. Remember, this was a city that had shrunk from over 1 million people at its imperial height to a small fraction of that by the medieval period, and was now being further ravaged by the deadliest pandemic in recorded European history, was simultaneously absorbing the physical destruction of a major seismic event. It's worth pausing on that convergence, because it helps explain something that becomes crucial to the rest of this story: why nobody rushed to repair the damage. A city in the grip of a pandemic killing a significant portion of its population, with municipal authority in disarray, with skilled labor either dead, dying, or fleeing, with the papacy itself, the single institution with the resources and authority to have organized a large-scale restoration project, physically absent from the city entirely, having relocated its official seat to Avignon in southern France decades earlier, as part of the period historians call the Avignon papacy, was in absolutely no position to mount any kind of coordinated response to structural damage suffered by an ancient pagan monument, however magnificent, sitting largely unused in a half-emptied, plague-stricken city. Contemporary accounts from the period, along with later chronicles drawing on records closer to the event, describe extensive damage across Rome from the 1349 earthquake, damage to churches, to towers, to the crumbling remnants of various ancient structures scattered across the city. And it is to this earthquake, more than to any other single documented event in the Colosseum's long history, that historians and archaeologists point as the primary cause of the structural catastrophe that gives the building its distinctive, lopsided silhouette today. The mechanism behind why the damage concentrated so specifically on the southern side of the structure, rather than distributing evenly around the entire ring, brings us back to something worth understanding about the ground the Colosseum was actually built on. The site chosen for the amphitheater, the drained lakebed that had previously formed part of Nero's palace grounds, was not uniform in its underlying geology. Portions of the site, particularly toward the south and east, sat on softer, less stable alluvial soil, remnants of the marshy, low-lying terrain that had made the site suitable for an artificial lake in the first place, while other portions of the foundation rested on firmer ground. Modern geological and engineering analysis of the site has confirmed that this variation in subsoil stability likely played a significant role in how the building responded to seismic stress. Sections resting on the softer alluvial ground were structurally more vulnerable to the kind of violent shaking a major earthquake produces, while sections anchored in firmer soil proved considerably more resilient. This geological detail, more than anything else, explains the fundamental asymmetry that defines the Colosseum's appearance today. It wasn't random. It wasn't simply that stones on one side happened to erode faster over the centuries. The ground itself, quite literally, was not equally trustworthy across the entire footprint of the building. And when the earthquake of 1349 finally arrived, delivering a seismic force the structure's aging, unmaintained, centuries-old iron and lead reinforcement system was no longer fully equipped to absorb. It was the southern portion of the ring, resting on that softer, less stable foundation, that gave way. We'll walk through exactly what that collapse looked like and what it left behind in the next chapter. But it's worth sitting, for a moment, with the strange symmetry of this story before we move forward. A building engineered specifically to withstand the seismic instability the Romans knew all too well existed beneath their city held firm against that same threat for roughly 1,000 years, only to finally fail at the precise moment its civilization's descendants were least equipped, least organized, and least resourced to do anything about it. Not because the engineering failed in some abstract sense, but because the world around the engineering had changed so completely that nobody remained who could repair what broke. The earthquake itself lasted, by any reasonable estimate, no more than a minute or two. What it set in motion would reshape the Colosseum for the rest of its existence. There is no surviving eyewitness account that describes, in detail, the exact moment the Colosseum's southern wall came down. No medieval chronicler happened to be standing in the right spot, at the right hour, to record the sound of 80,000 cubic meters of Roman travertine tearing itself loose from 1,000 years of iron and lead and gravity, and putting it into words for us to read 7 centuries later. This is one of the frustrating realities of medieval history, the collapse of one of the most significant structures of the ancient world, an event that permanently altered the appearance of what is today one of the most photographed buildings on Earth, happened almost entirely off the page, documented only indirectly, pieced together after the fact from scattered references, structural evidence, and the patient work of later historians and archaeologists trying to reconstruct what the surviving physical evidence tells us must have happened. What we can reconstruct, with a fair degree of confidence, goes something like this. By the afternoon or evening of September 6, 1349, the earthquake's seismic waves had already rippled outward from their epicenter in the Apennines and reached Rome, shaking a city already reeling under the advancing wave of the Black Death. Buildings across Rome, churches, towers, fortified noble compounds, the crumbling remnants of other ancient Roman monuments still standing across the city, absorbed varying degrees of damage depending on their construction, their age, and the specific geological conditions of the ground beneath them. And at the Colosseum, the seismic stress traveling through the earth encountered a structure whose southern portion, as we discussed, rested on that softer, less stable alluvial ground, and whose 1,000-year-old iron reinforcement system had, over the intervening centuries, likely already begun suffering the slow degradation that untreated iron exposed to weather, moisture, and time inevitably undergoes. Modern structural analysis of ancient Roman ironwork tells us something important here. The iron clamps used throughout Roman construction, while remarkably effective when properly sealed and maintained, were vulnerable over extremely long timescales to a specific, slow-acting problem: corrosion. Iron rusts. And when iron embedded in stone begins to rust, it doesn't simply weaken quietly. Rusting iron actually expands, sometimes significantly, exerting outward pressure on the surrounding stone from the inside as the corrosion process progresses. Over centuries, particularly in sections of the wall exposed to rainwater infiltration through cracks or gaps in the original lead seals, this internal expansion can cause exactly the kind of slow, invisible structural weakening that leaves a stone wall looking solid from the outside, while becoming progressively more fragile and prone to catastrophic failure under sudden stress from within. Combine that slow, centuries-long process of internal weakening with the specific geological vulnerability of the southern foundation, and you have, in effect, a structure that had been quietly becoming more fragile in one particular section for generations, entirely invisible to anyone looking at it from the outside, right up until a major regional earthquake delivered exactly the kind of sudden, violent lateral stress capable of exploiting that hidden weakness all at once. The result, based on the archaeological and structural evidence available to us today, was not a gentle settling or a partial crack. It was, by every indication historians and engineers have been able to piece together, a genuine large-scale structural collapse. A substantial portion of the outer ring's southern arc, representing what modern estimates suggest may have amounted to roughly a third of the entire outer wall's original circumference, giving way and coming down, very likely in a matter of seconds, in a catastrophic cascade of failing stone and snapping, corroded ironwork. Try to actually picture the physical reality of that moment, because it is almost too large a thing to hold in your head all at once. This was not a wall falling the way a wall falls in a house, a single vertical plane toppling over. This was 4 full stories of massive, multi-ton travertine blocks, an outer facade built from 100,000 cubic meters of quarried stone, tearing loose from its neighboring sections and crashing downward and outward, an avalanche of ancient Roman engineering collapsing in on itself in a matter of moments, throwing up what must have been an enormous cloud of dust and debris visible across a significant portion of the surrounding city, and producing a sound, if we allow ourselves to imagine it, since no chronicler recorded it directly, that must have carried its own kind of seismic force, the structural equivalent of thunder, generated not by the sky, but by the ground giving way beneath one of the largest man-made structures on the entire Italian peninsula. The immediate physical result was a landscape transformed, where, only hours before, a 4-story ring of gleaming, if by now centuries weathered and soot-darkened, travertine arches had stood, there was now a jagged, broken lower wall on the southern side, rising to barely a fraction of its original height, its exposed inner face showing the raw rubble and mortar core construction that Roman builders had always hidden beneath the finished travertine facing, never intended to be visible at all, and spread across the ground in front of that broken wall, covering what had once been open plaza and street, lay an almost unimaginable quantity of shattered and semi-intact stone, massive travertine blocks, some fully intact and simply displaced, others shattered into more manageable fragments by the force of the fall, mixed with twisted, corroded iron clamps that had once bound the structure together and were now lying exposed and useless in the rubble. This pile of rubble, as strange as it sounds, is actually one of the most important elements of the entire story we're telling, because what happened to that rubble, in the months, years, and eventually centuries that followed, tells us almost everything we need to know about how the rest of the Colosseum's missing half came to disappear. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, with Rome's population devastated by plague, its municipal government in disarray, and the papacy still headquartered in distant Avignon rather than in Rome itself, there was, quite simply, no institutional capacity to do anything about the collapse at all. Nobody organized a restoration project. Nobody attempted to rebuild the fallen section, or even to properly clear the debris in any systematic way. The rubble was simply left where it fell, an enormous, chaotic field of fractured ancient stone, sitting in the shadow of the building's still standing northern half, slowly becoming overgrown, slowly becoming, in the eyes of the surviving residents of a badly wounded medieval city, less like the ruins of a catastrophic architectural failure and more like something else entirely. It became, In the eyes of a city desperately short on resources and building material, an opportunity. Because here is the detail that turns this story from a simple tale of earthquake damage into something considerably more interesting and considerably more troubling. 14th century Rome, in the wake of this collapse, was a city facing an entirely different kind of crisis than the one the earthquake itself had caused. The Black Death had killed a devastating portion of the city's population. The economy was in ruins. Construction projects across the city, churches needing repair, fortifications needing reinforcement, the ordinary infrastructure of a struggling medieval town needing constant maintenance. All required stone, and stone, quarried fresh from a source like the Travertine deposits at Tivoli that had originally supplied the Colosseum's builders, was expensive and labor-intensive to produce, requiring skilled quarrying, careful transport, and precise cutting. And right there, sitting in an enormous pile in the middle of the city, freely available, already cut, already shaped into usable blocks by some of the finest stonemasons the ancient world had ever produced, was precisely the raw material an economically devastated medieval Rome desperately needed. Nobody, in the years immediately following 1349, needed to convince the residents of Rome that this rubble represented an opportunity. That realization would have been more or less immediate and obvious to anyone looking at the pile of pre-cut, high-quality travertine blocks lying exposed and unguarded in the middle of the city. What took longer to develop, and what would ultimately determine the true scale of what was eventually lost from the Colosseum, was the transformation of this opportunistic, informal scavenging into something far more organized, far more sustained, and ultimately, far more official. Desperate medieval Romans hauling away rubble from a collapsed wall was only the start. Over the following centuries, that instinct hardened into something far more deliberate, an officially sanctioned, papally licensed quarrying operation, one that didn't stop at the fallen rubble, but moved on to the still-standing portions of the monument itself, stripping away stone that had survived the earthquake perfectly intact to build some of the most famous landmarks of Renaissance Rome. The earthquake broke the wall. What came after broke the building's future entirely. There's a particular kind of historical irony sitting at the center of this next stretch of the story, and it's worth naming directly before we walk through it. The earthquake of 1349 did real, undeniable, structural damage to the Colosseum, but the earthquake alone did not create the lopsided ruin you see standing in Rome today. What the earthquake did was open a door. What walked through that door, over the following 4 centuries, was something far more deliberate, far more sustained, and in its own way, far more consequential than a single night of seismic violence. To understand how a pile of collapsed rubble evolved into a centuries-long, systematic dismantling of one of the ancient world's greatest achievements, we have to understand something about how medieval and Renaissance Romans actually related to the ruins scattered across their city, because it was a relationship almost entirely foreign to the way we think about historical preservation today. Modern visitors to Rome tend to arrive with an inherited, largely unquestioned assumption that ancient ruins are precious, that they belong to all of humanity, that a structure like the Colosseum is a treasure to be protected at almost any cost. This attitude, as intuitive as it feels to us now, is a relatively modern invention, and it was almost entirely absent from the mindset of the people actually living among these ruins during the medieval and early Renaissance periods. To a 14th or 15th century Roman, the countless ancient structures scattered across their city, forums, temples, theaters, aqueducts, and yes, the Colosseum, were not primarily historical treasures. They were, more practically and more urgently, an enormous, freely available quarry of pre-cut, high-quality building stone, sitting and used in the middle of a city that desperately needed exactly that resource to rebuild and maintain itself. This wasn't a fringe or shameful attitude, kept quiet out of embarrassment. It was, for centuries, official, sanctioned, entirely respectable practice, formalized, in fact, at the very highest levels of Roman civic and religious authority. The Latin term historians use for this practice is spoliation, drawn from the same root as the English word spoils, and it refers to the systematic reuse of stone, marble, columns, and other building materials scavenged from older structures to construct newer ones. Spoliation was, in fact, already a well-established practice in Rome long before the Colosseum's southern wall ever collapsed. Visitors to Rome today can see spolia, reused ancient material, incorporated directly into structures like the Arch of Constantine, built in the early 4th century using sculptural elements deliberately taken from earlier monuments associated with previous emperors. A practice the Romans themselves saw not as vandalism, but as a kind of continuity, a way of linking new construction to the authority and legitimacy of what came before. What changed in the centuries following the 1349 earthquake was the scale, the target, and eventually the level of official sanction behind this practice as it applied specifically to the Colosseum. In the immediate decades after the collapse, the scavenging appears to have been relatively informal. Individual Romans and small building projects helping themselves to loose, already fallen material from the rubble field left by the earthquake, a practice that required no special permission because the material was, in a practical sense, simply lying there, already displaced from the structure, already broken into transportable pieces. This kind of informal, small-scale scavenging likely continued for decades, gradually reducing the size and prominence of the rubble field without yet touching the still-standing portions of the building. But by the 15th century, as Rome slowly began recovering from the devastating population losses and economic devastation of the Black Death, and particularly as the papacy formally returned to Rome from its decades-long relocation to Avignon, an event historians refer to as the end of the Avignon papacy, restoring Rome's status as the actual seat of papal power rather than a largely symbolic one. The city entered a new phase of ambitious, large-scale building projects. Popes returning to a city that had suffered nearly 70 years of relative civic and architectural neglect during their absence found themselves needing to rebuild and reassert Rome's status as the center of Christendom, and that meant an explosion of major construction projects. New churches, renovated basilicas, grand papal residences, fortifications, bridges, roads. An entire building boom driven by both practical necessity and deliberate political statement, all requiring vast quantities of stone. And it was against this backdrop of renewed, ambitious Roman construction that the still-standing portions of the Colosseum, not merely the fallen rubble, but the intact, undamaged sections of the ancient amphitheater's outer wall and interior structure, began to be viewed, increasingly openly, as an acceptable and even sensible source of pre-cut building material for the Renaissance city's new wave of construction. Historical records indicate that by the mid-15th century, this practice had moved well beyond informal scavenging and into something closer to officially organized extraction. Church and civic authorities in Rome are documented as having granted formal licenses and permissions allowing specific individuals, families, and building projects to remove stone directly from the Colosseum for use in other construction, turning what had once been the site of opportunistic post-earthquake scavenging into a recognized, sanctioned supply chain for the city's building industry. This is a critical distinction. It was not theft in the eyes of the authorities who sanctioned it. It was resource management. The Colosseum, no longer serving any function its medieval and Renaissance inhabitants considered active or valuable, was treated, quite literally, as a stone quarry that happened to already be shaped into convenient, load-bearing blocks, arguably more valuable in that condition than an equivalent quantity of unquarried stone would have been, since the labor of the original Roman stonemasons had already done the difficult work of cutting and shaping it. The economics of this arrangement made a certain brutal sense when you consider the alternative available to Renaissance builders. Quarrying fresh travertine from the deposits near Tivoli, the same source the original Roman builders had used, required organizing teams of skilled quarry workers, cutting massive blocks from bedrock using labor-intensive methods that hadn't fundamentally changed much since antiquity, and then transporting those blocks roughly 20 miles overland to the city, an expensive and time-consuming logistical undertaking. By contrast, the Colosseum sat directly within the city itself, its stone already cut to substantial, usable dimensions by master craftsmen 15 centuries earlier, requiring only the comparatively modest labor of prying blocks loose, breaking them down to more manageable transport sizes where necessary, and hauling them the relatively short distance to whatever new construction site needed them. From a purely economic standpoint, Quarrying the Colosseum wasn't just convenient. For a Renaissance builder working within realistic budget and timeline constraints, it may well have been the obviously rational choice. This is, perhaps, the most uncomfortable part of the entire story, and it deserves more than a passing mention. The people who authorized and carried out the systematic dismantling of the Colosseum were not, by the standards of their own time, acting recklessly, ignorantly, or maliciously. They were operating within an entirely coherent, broadly accepted worldview in which an unused ancient structure, no matter how magnificent, existed primarily as a practical resource available to serve the needs of the living city around it. A worldview that simply had not yet developed the modern concept of heritage preservation as a value capable of overriding practical economic considerations. Several of the individuals and institutions who authorized or benefited from this quarrying were themselves cultured, educated figures of the early Renaissance. Men who could quote Latin poetry and appreciate classical architecture in the abstract, even as they simultaneously sanctioned tearing that same classical architecture apart, stone by stone, for their own construction projects. It wasn't hypocrisy exactly. It was simply a different, and to us now deeply strange, set of priorities. By the time this practice reached its most intensive and systematic phase, which we'll trace in detail in the chapters that follow, the quarrying of the Colosseum had evolved from opportunistic post-earthquake scavenging into a formalized, decade-spanning campaign that would eventually see its stone incorporated into some of the most celebrated buildings of the entire Italian Renaissance. Structures that millions of visitors walk past every year today with absolutely no awareness that the stone beneath their feet, or the columns rising above their heads, began its existence as part of one of the ancient world's greatest engineering achievements. The rubble field left by the 1349 earthquake, in other words, was only ever the opening chapter of this story, the initial breach that made the idea of taking stone from the Colosseum thinkable, respectable, and eventually, officially licensed. What followed was not a single dramatic act of destruction, but something slower, more bureaucratic, and in its own quiet way, considerably more thorough. A centuries-long campaign, sanctioned at the highest levels of Roman religious and civic authority, that would ultimately determine exactly how much of the ancient world's greatest amphitheater would still be standing by the time it was finally, belatedly, recognized as something worth protecting rather than something worth quarrying. That recognition came centuries too late to save what had already been carried away, but not too late to save what remained. Where that stone actually ended up, and who finally stood up and said the plundering had gone far enough, is what the rest of this story tracks down. By the middle of the 15th century, something had shifted in how Rome's authorities related to the Colosseum, and it's worth being precise about what that shift actually was, because it's easy to flatten it into a simpler story than the one the records actually support. It would be tidy to say that at some point a single pope signed a single decree that turned the Colosseum into a quarry, and from that point forward the plunder proceeded in an orderly, documented line. The reality is messier and, in its own way, more revealing. The transformation of the Colosseum from an occasionally scavenged ruin into a formally licensed source of construction material happened gradually, through a series of individual grants, permissions, and informal arrangements made by different popes, different noble families, and different building projects across roughly 2 centuries. Each decision made on its own terms, for its own immediate purpose, with apparently little thought given to the cumulative effect all these individual choices were having on the structure as a whole. That detail changes the shape of the story. This wasn't a single villain making a single terrible decision. It was something closer to a slow, bureaucratic erosion, carried out by dozens of different hands across generations, each one convinced their particular request was reasonable, each one probably unaware, or unconcerned, that they were participating in a pattern that would, over time, remove roughly half of one of the largest buildings ever constructed in the ancient world. The documentary record for exactly how and when specific licenses were granted is, as is often the case with medieval and early Renaissance administrative history, incomplete and scattered across various archives. But historians studying the period have identified a consistent pattern across the 15th and 16th centuries. Church officials, prominent Roman families, and building supervisors overseeing major construction projects repeatedly petitioned for, and received permission to extract stone from the Colosseum, treating the ancient structure less as a protected monument and more as a municipal resource available for allocation, not unlike a public quarry that happened to already contain finished, pre-cut material. One of the clearer patterns to emerge from the historical record involves the role of what were called the conservatory, a body of Roman civic officials responsible, among other things, for managing certain public resources and properties within the city, including, apparently, authority over portions of the ancient ruins scattered across Rome. Records from this period show the conservatory granting permits to individuals seeking to extract stone from various ancient sites around the city and the Colosseum, given its sheer size and the correspondingly enormous quantity of usable material it represented, appears repeatedly in these records as a favored source. What's striking, reading through the surviving fragments of this administrative history, is how thoroughly ordinary the practice had become by this point. These aren't records of scandal or controversy. They read, for the most part, like unremarkable municipal paperwork: permission granted, quantity specified, purpose noted, next request processed. A building that had once represented the absolute pinnacle of Roman imperial engineering had been fully absorbed into the mundane administrative machinery of a working Renaissance city, its stone treated with roughly the same bureaucratic indifference a modern city might apply to allocating gravel from a municipal quarry. The quarrying methods themselves, based on archaeological evidence and the physical scars still visible on the building today, appear to have followed a fairly consistent extraction process. Workers would target the still-standing arches and wall sections, working to pry loose individual travertine blocks along their original mortar joints wherever possible, a method that preserved the blocks in something close to their original cut dimensions, making them considerably more valuable and useful for new construction than material that had to be recut from scratch. Where blocks couldn't be cleanly separated along existing joints, workers used wedges, picks, and other basic quarrying tools to fracture the stone into more manageable, if less pristine, pieces. This extraction process left behind a distinctive kind of damage that archaeologists and architectural historians studying the Colosseum today can still read directly off the surviving stone, almost like a wound that never fully healed. Sections of the building where quarrying activity was concentrated show a characteristic stepped, irregular profile, walls that don't taper gradually with weathering the way naturally eroded stone does, but instead show sharp, angular absences where entire blocks were deliberately removed, leaving neighboring stones exposed at odd angles that were never meant to face outward. If you know what you're looking at, walking around the Colosseum today, you can actually distinguish between sections that collapsed from earthquake damage and sections that were deliberately quarried. The earthquake damage tends to show the more chaotic, randomly fractured pattern you'd expect from sudden structural failure, while the quarried sections show something closer to methodical excavation, block by block, layer by layer. Work from the outside in. It's worth pausing here to address something that tends to surprise people encountering this history for the first time: the sheer scale of what was being extracted. This wasn't a matter of a few decorative stones being pilfered here and there for minor repairs. Modern estimates, based on comparing the building's original calculated volume of quarried stone against what remains standing today, suggest that a substantial portion of the Colosseum's original travertine, likely somewhere in the range of several 100,000 cubic feet of stone, though precise figures vary depending on the methodology used, was ultimately removed from the structure over the centuries of active quarrying, above and beyond whatever was lost in the initial 1349 collapse itself. In other words, the earthquake accounts for a significant portion of the missing structure, but it does not, on its own, account for the full extent of what's gone. A meaningful share of the building's absence is attributable not to the ground shaking, but to human hands, working with picks and wedges, over the course of roughly 2 centuries, block by deliberate block. The individuals actually doing this physical labor, the quarry workers themselves, occupy an almost entirely anonymous position in the historical record. We know, from scattered references and comparisons to labor practices at other Roman construction sites of the period, that this kind of work was generally carried out by skilled but low-status laborers, often organized into small teams under the direction of a master builder or foreman who held the actual extraction license and answered to whichever patron, church official, noble family, or building project had commissioned the work. These were, in all likelihood, ordinary working Romans, doing a job that, from their own perspective, probably looked entirely unremarkable. Quarrying stone, the same basic trade that had existed in Rome for over 1,000 years, applied to a source that happened to be more convenient than the alternatives. There's no indication in the surviving record that these workers approached their task with any particular sense of transgression or historical weight. They were doing what quarry workers did, extracting usable stone from an available source, under license, for pay. This anonymity matters, because it reinforces something important about how we should understand this entire period of the Colosseum's history. There's a natural temptation, looking back from the present, to want a villain, a single identifiable figure we can point to and say, this person is responsible for the destruction of one of the ancient world's great monuments. But the actual historical process resists that kind of narrative. What happened to the Colosseum during these centuries wasn't an act of destruction carried out by any one person or even any one institution acting with destructive intent. It was something closer to a slow, distributed, largely unremarkable pattern of resource extraction carried out by dozens of different licensees, hundreds of anonymous laborers, and multiple generations of civic officials, none of whom, as far as the record shows, ever framed what they were doing as an act of vandalism against a treasured monument, because that concept, the idea that ancient ruins possessed a kind of inherent, protected value simply by virtue of their age and historical significance, had not yet fully crystallized in the culture they were operating within. That said, it would be inaccurate to suggest nobody at the time recognized what was happening, or that the practice went entirely without comment or concern. As we'll see in a later chapter, the 18th century would eventually produce a decisive institutional response that finally halted the quarrying for good, evidence that the seeds of a different, more protective attitude toward the Colosseum's remains were present, at least among certain figures, well before that final intervention. But for the bulk of the 15th and 16th centuries, and well into the 17th, the dominant institutional attitude toward the Colosseum's surviving stone was overwhelmingly practical rather than protective, a resource to be allocated, not a monument to be shielded. And the projects that resource was allocated to were not minor ones. They were, in several notable cases, among the most prestigious and ambitious building campaigns of the entire Italian Renaissance. Churches and palaces that remain, to this day, among the most visited and celebrated structures in Rome, their travertine facades and structural cores carrying, quite literally, pieces of the same stone that once rose in perfect classical sequence above the heads of 80,000 cheering Roman spectators. Which grand Renaissance buildings, still standing today and still photographed by millions of tourists a year, actually owe a structural debt to the ancient amphitheater those same tourists will visit later that same afternoon. That's next. If you were to spend a single afternoon in Rome walking a specific, deliberate route, starting at the Colosseum, and then making your way toward a handful of the city's other most celebrated landmarks, you would, without necessarily realizing it, be tracing the physical journey that a significant quantity of ancient Roman travertine took across roughly 2 centuries of quarrying. This chapter follows that journey, building by building, and it's worth walking through slowly, because the specific destinations tell us something important about just how central the Colosseum's stone became to the architectural identity of Renaissance and early modern Rome. Perhaps the most frequently cited and best documented example is the Palazzo Venezia, a substantial Renaissance palace located near the base of the Capitoline Hill, constructed beginning in the mid-15th century for Cardinal Pietro Barbo, who would later become Pope Paul II. Historical and archival records associated with the palace's construction indicate that a considerable quantity of travertine used in building its walls and structural elements was sourced directly from the Colosseum, extracted under license during the palace's active construction period. Today, the Palazzo Venezia is perhaps most widely known to the general public for a very different reason entirely. It later served, during the 20th century, as the official headquarters and residence of Benito Mussolini, and it was from a balcony on this building's facade that Mussolini delivered numerous public addresses to crowds gathered in the piazza below. There's a strange historical layering embedded in that fact. a building constructed substantially from stone quarried out of one of ancient Rome's most iconic structures would go on to become, nearly 500 years later, the stage from which a 20th-century dictator delivered speeches invoking the glory of Rome's imperial past, standing, quite literally, on ground built from the bones of that very empire's most famous surviving monument. Perhaps even more significant, in terms of sheer prestige and visibility, is the connection historians have drawn between Colosseum stone and the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, arguably the single most important building in the entire history of the Catholic Church, and one of the most visited religious sites on Earth. The reconstruction of St. Peter's, begun in the early 16th century under Pope Julius II, and continuing across more than a century of subsequent construction under a long succession of popes and architects, including figures as celebrated as Bramante, Michelangelo, and Bernini, represented one of the most ambitious and materially demanding building projects in the entire history of Western architecture. A construction campaign operating at this scale, spanning multiple pontificates and requiring enormous quantities of stone for its foundations, walls, and structural elements, naturally drew on every available source of building material the city could offer, and historical records indicate that among those sources was travertine extracted from the Colosseum, incorporated into the ongoing construction of what would become, upon its eventual completion in the early 17th century, the largest church in the world. There's something oddly fitting about that particular connection. St. Peter's Basilica stands, symbolically and literally, at the absolute center of the Catholic Church's global authority, the building where popes are traditionally installed, where some of the most significant ceremonies in the Church's history have taken place, visited by millions of pilgrims and tourists every single year. And embedded within its structure, largely invisible to the naked eye of any visitor walking through its vast nave today, is stone that once formed part of a pagan Roman amphitheater built specifically to host gladiatorial combat and the public killing of animals, and, in some documented cases during the Colosseum's later centuries of use, Christian martyrs. A detail that adds a particular kind of resonance to the whole story, since later Catholic tradition, as we'll see in a subsequent chapter, would eventually come to regard the Colosseum itself as sacred ground, consecrated specifically in memory of Christian martyrdom believed to have occurred there. Beyond these two especially well-documented cases, historical and archival evidence points to Colosseum stone being incorporated into a range of other significant Roman construction projects across the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The Palazzo Barberini, a grand palace constructed in the early 17th century for the powerful Barberini family, whose most famous member, Maffeo Barberini, became Pope Urban VIII, is another structure historians associate with the use of quarried ancient material, consistent with the broader pattern of prominent Roman families drawing on available ancient stone sources, including the Colosseum, for their major building projects during this period. Various church construction and renovation projects scattered across Rome during these centuries similarly drew on the same general pool of available quarried material. Though the documentary trail connecting specific stones in specific buildings back to a specific point of origin at the Colosseum becomes considerably harder to trace with precision the further we move from the handful of especially well-documented major projects. It's worth being honest, at this point in the story, about the limits of what the historical record actually allows us to say with full confidence. Popular accounts of the Colosseum's plundering sometimes present an almost complete inventory of every building in Rome constructed from its stone, with a level of specificity the underlying archival evidence doesn't always fully support. What we can say with genuine confidence, based on the documentary record that does survive, building accounts, licensing records, and the physical evidence of extraction patterns visible on the Colosseum itself, is that the practice was widespread, sustained across roughly 2 centuries, and connected to at least several major, well-documented, still-standing Renaissance landmarks including the Palazzo Venezia, and, per historical accounts of the construction campaign, contributing in some capacity to the ongoing building of St. Peter's Basilica. Beyond these clearer cases, the broader pattern of quarrying almost certainly touched numerous smaller, less individually documented projects across the city as well. The ordinary churches, houses, and civic buildings of Renaissance Rome that didn't generate the same volume of surviving archival paperwork as a papal basilica or a cardinal's palace, but which nonetheless likely drew, in smaller and harder-to-trace quantities, on the same generally available pool of quarried ancient stone, circulating through the city's building trade during these centuries. There's a particular kind of vertigo available to anyone who actually internalizes this pattern and then goes and stands in the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica or walks past the Palazzo Venezia on the way to the Colosseum itself. These buildings are, in the most literal physical sense, made partly out of each other's history. The ancient amphitheater and the Renaissance basilica are not simply two separate landmarks that happen to share a city. They are, at the level of individual stone blocks, connected to one another, bound together by a supply chain of quarrying, transport, and construction that most visitors walking between them today have no reason to suspect exists at all. This raises an interesting question worth pausing on, even if it doesn't have a fully satisfying answer. How should we actually feel about this? It would be easy to frame the whole story purely as loss, as vandalism, as short-sighted plunder, as a tragedy inflicted on one of humanity's great monuments by a civilization too preoccupied with its own immediate needs to recognize the value of what it was destroying. And there's real truth in that framing. Something irreplaceable was lost from the Colosseum during these centuries, and no amount of context or historical explanation fully erases that loss. But it's also true that the stone wasn't destroyed in any absolute sense. It was transformed, redirected, given a second architectural life within buildings that themselves became, over the following centuries, treasured monuments in their own right. St. Peter's Basilica is not, by any reasonable measure, a lesser or less significant piece of human achievement than the Colosseum it partially cannibalized. In a strange way, the very same impulse that drove the plunder of the Colosseum, the belief that stone should serve the practical and spiritual needs of the living city, rather than sit untouched as a monument to a vanished past, is also, in its own inverted form, a kind of continuity. Roman civilization, in a literal architectural sense, never entirely stopped building with the same material. It simply kept redirecting that material toward whatever the current century's priorities happened to be. That doesn't make the loss any less real, and it's worth being clear-eyed about that. But it does complicate the simple morality tale version of this story, the version where a villain destroys a treasure and we're left simply to mourn what's gone. The truth is messier, more human, and in its own way more interesting. An ancient wonder, partially dismantled by its own descendants, quietly living on, stone by displaced stone, inside some of the very buildings those same descendants raised in its place. There's one more piece of physical evidence from this whole extraction process worth examining closely before we move forward. Evidence that isn't about where the stone went, but about what was left behind on the building itself, marking exactly where and how it was taken. And that evidence is written directly into the surface of the surviving Colosseum walls, in the form of thousands of small, strange, deliberately placed holes that most visitors walk right past without ever understanding what they're actually looking at. There's a detail about the Colosseum that, once someone points it out to you, becomes almost impossible to unsee, and it has nothing to do with the missing southern wall at all. It's something much smaller, much subtler, and in its own way, arguably even more revealing about the specific mechanics of how this building was picked apart over the centuries. If you look closely at the surviving surface of the Colosseum's outer walls, particularly on sections where the original travertine facing remains intact rather than having been entirely stripped away, you'll notice something that looks, at first glance, almost decorative, a scattered pattern of small, roughly rectangular or dovetail-shaped holes and indentations, distributed across the stone in a way that seems too regular to be random weathering, but too irregular to be unintentional. Architectural design. These holes are not damage in the conventional sense, not cracks, not chips, not the kind of erosion you'd expect from centuries of rain and sun. They are, instead, precisely shaped voids, and they mark one of the most systematic and, in its own way, most thorough forms of scavenging the Colosseum ever experienced. These are the sockets left behind by the removal of the building's original iron clamps. The very same 300 tons of metal reinforcement, sealed in molten lead, that Roman engineers had originally embedded throughout the structure's outer ring specifically to bind the stone blocks together and give the building its seismic resilience. And at some point, likely beginning not long after the Western Roman Empire's political collapse and continuing in waves across the following centuries, those metal clamps became a target for scavenging in their own right, separate from, and in some ways predating, the large-scale stone quarrying campaigns of the Renaissance period we've been discussing. The logic behind targeting the clamps specifically is not hard to understand once you think about the relative value of iron versus stone in the medieval economy. Stone, however useful, was relatively abundant and, once quarried, primarily valuable as raw building bulk. Iron, by contrast, was considerably more valuable per unit of weight throughout most of the medieval period, a period during which metalworking, smelting, and iron production were far more labor-intensive and resource-limited processes than they would later become. A blacksmith operating in medieval Rome, of the kind archaeological evidence suggests actually set up workshops within the Colosseum's own arches during the early medieval period, would have had every practical incentive imaginable to view the building's embedded ironwork as an enormously convenient, already processed source of raw metal, requiring only the labor of extraction rather than the far more difficult work of mining and smelting fresh ore. The physical process of extracting these clamps left the specific kind of damage pattern still visible on the building's surviving stone today. To reach the iron clamp embedded within a joint between two travertine blocks, scavengers needed to chip away at the surrounding stone and the lead seal encasing the metal, creating an access channel that widened as the extraction progressed, until the clamp itself could be pried or hammered free. This process, repeated across literally thousands of individual clamp locations distributed throughout the building's original construction, left behind exactly the kind of scattered, roughly rectangular pockmarking that covers so much of the Colosseum's surviving surface today. Small wounds, individually modest in size, but staggering in their cumulative number when you consider that the original structure incorporated an estimated 300 tons of iron clamps distributed across its entire outer ring. It's hard to overstate just how numerous these clamp sockets are, once you start actually counting them on the surviving walls. Architectural surveys of the Colosseum's remaining stonework have documented many thousands of individual extraction points across the building's surface, a density of scavenging activity that speaks to just how systematically and thoroughly this particular form of plunder was carried out, likely by many different individuals and groups working across an extended period, each one chipping away at whatever clamps they could access, gradually turning the building's surface into something resembling a pockmarked, weathered honeycomb. There's a particular irony embedded in this specific form of damage that connects directly back to the story we told in Chapter 5. Remember that the iron clamps, and specifically the way untreated iron corrodes and expands over time when exposed to moisture, likely played a meaningful role in weakening the structural integrity of the southern wall in the lead-up to its catastrophic collapse during the 1349 earthquake. In other words, the very metal that scavengers were extracting from the building's surviving sections, chipping it free piece by piece over the centuries, was simultaneously, through a slow, invisible process of corrosion happening to the clamps that hadn't yet been removed, contributing to the structural vulnerability that would eventually bring down an entire third of the building's outer ring. The scavenging of the clamps and the earthquake that destroyed the southern wall aren't, technically, the same event or even directly connected in a simple cause and effect sense, but they're both symptoms of the same underlying reality, a building whose original reinforcement system, brilliant as it was for its time, was never designed to survive centuries of both metallurgical decay and active human extraction happening simultaneously, unchecked, with no organized authority present to prevent or repair either process. What's particularly striking, standing in front of the surviving walls today and actually looking closely at this pockmarked surface, is how it complicates the simple story of the earthquake versus deliberate quarrying that this whole account has been building toward. The clamp hole damage represents a third, distinct category of loss, not the sudden violence of seismic collapse, and not the large-scale, organized stone quarrying licensed by church and civic authorities for major building projects, but something closer to sustained, small-scale, opportunistic scavenging, likely carried out by countless individual actors over an extended period, each one taking a comparatively modest amount of material for their own immediate practical needs, but collectively inflicting a level of surface damage across the entire building that is, in its own quiet way, just as pervasive and just as historically significant as either of the other two more dramatic causes. This detail also helps answer a question that might occur to anyone hearing this story for the first time. If so much stone was removed from the Colosseum over the centuries, why does the surviving northern half still look, from a distance, relatively intact and impressive, rather than obviously stripped and cannibalized? Part of the answer lies precisely in this distinction between different categories of damage. The large-scale stone quarrying we discussed in the previous two chapters was concentrated primarily on sections of the building that had already been weakened or partially exposed, and on material that could be efficiently extracted in large, useful blocks, meaning the most intensive quarrying activity clustered disproportionately around the already damaged southern side and certain accessible interior sections, rather than uniformly stripping the entire structure from top to bottom. The surviving northern arc, by contrast, retained enough of its original structural integrity and enough political or practical protection, likely tied to the specific way property rights, licenses, and access to different sections of the building were allocated over the centuries, that it avoided the same intensity of large block extraction, even as it absorbed its own share of the smaller-scale clamp scavenging that left those thousands of small pockmarks scattered across its surface. There's one more layer to this story of extraction worth understanding before we move toward the story's eventual turning point, because iron clamps and large stone blocks were not the only material the Colosseum yielded to the centuries of scavenging it endured. There was a third category of material embedded throughout the building that proved, in its own way, just as valuable to the medieval and Renaissance economy as either the metal or the stone: marble. And what happened to a significant portion of that marble takes this story somewhere unsettling. Because unlike stone repurposed into a palace wall, or iron reforged into tools, the marble stripped from the Colosseum's seating and decorative elements was very often destroyed entirely, reduced through fire to something that could never again be recovered, restored, or identified as having once been part of an ancient monument at all. That process, and the grim industrial site where it happened right at the edge of the arena itself, is next. Of everything that was taken from the Colosseum across the centuries of its slow dismantling, the fate of its marble is, in a certain sense, the most final and the most difficult to fully reckon with. Because unlike the travertine blocks hauled off to become the walls of the Palazzo Venezia, or the iron clamps repurposed into medieval tools and hardware, a significant portion of the Colosseum's original marble was not preserved in any recognizable form at all. It was burned. To understand why, we need to understand a specific, essential material in medieval and Renaissance construction that most people today never think about at all: lime. Quicklime, produced by burning limestone or marble at extremely high temperatures in a specialized furnace called a lime kiln, was one of the fundamental building blocks of pre-modern construction technology, serving as the essential ingredient in mortar, the binding paste that held stone and brick construction together across the entire history of Western architecture up through the modern era. Without a reliable supply of quicklime, a medieval or Renaissance city simply could not build, repair, or maintain its structures at any meaningful scale. It was, in the most literal sense, as fundamentally necessary to the construction industry of the period as cement is today. And here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Marble, chemically, is an extremely high-quality source material for producing quicklime, arguably a better source, in terms of purity and resulting product quality, than many of the more common limestone sources available in the region. And the Colosseum, as we discussed back in Chapter 2, was originally adorned throughout its interior with substantial quantities of marble. The decorative facing on portions of the seating tiers, elements of the podium reserved for senators and the imperial family, and various architectural and sculptural details scattered throughout the structure's interior. To a medieval or Renaissance builder facing the constant, ongoing demand for quicklime that any active construction project required, the Colosseum represented a premium source of exactly the raw material needed to produce the mortar that would hold new buildings together. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates that lime burning activity was carried out directly at or near the Colosseum itself across an extended period spanning the medieval and into the early modern era, a detail that adds an almost haunting dimension to this part of the story. This wasn't a matter of marble being carefully removed from the Colosseum and transported to some distant lime production facility elsewhere in the city. In at least some documented cases, the burning itself took place close to or even within the ancient structure, meaning that portions of the Colosseum's own interior functioned, for a period, as an active industrial site, a working lime kiln operation, quite possibly situated near or even within the arena itself. The very same ground where gladiators had once fought and animals had once been paraded before tens of thousands of spectators, repurposed centuries later into a functional furnace. Complex for reducing ancient marble into raw construction material. There is something hard to fully take in about that image, and it deserves a moment rather than a quick pass. Picture the specific physical process actually taking place. Teams of workers gathering marble fragments. Architectural facing, decorative elements, quite possibly including carved or sculpted pieces that had once represented some of the finest decorative stonework the ancient world produced, and loading them into a kiln, or sustained, intense heat, typically requiring temperatures well in excess of 800 degrees Celsius sustained over an extended burning period, would chemically transform that marble, breaking down its calcium carbonate structure and converting it into quicklime. The process is, chemically speaking, entirely irreversible. Once marble has been burned down into quicklime, there is no way to reconstitute it, no way to recover the original stone, no way to ever again identify what specific piece of decorative or structural marble that particular batch of lime had once been. It simply ceases, in any meaningful sense, to exist as marble at all, becoming, instead, an entirely different substance, destined to be mixed with water and sand and used as mortar in the construction of some other building entirely. Its original identity and history completely and permanently erased in the process. This detail helps explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling about the Colosseum's surviving appearance today: the near total absence of marble anywhere on the structure, even in sections of the building that otherwise retained a significant amount of their original travertine. Visitors walking through the Colosseum today, admiring the surviving stonework of the north and east sections, will notice they're looking almost exclusively at plain, undecorated travertine. The structural bones of the building, essentially, with almost none of the decorative marble facing, veneer, or sculptural ornamentation that would originally have adorned significant portions of its interior, particularly around the podium level and the more prestigious seating areas closest to the arena floor. That marble isn't simply worn away or weathered into an unrecognizable state the way stone sometimes is after centuries of exposure. In a great many cases, it's gone in the most absolute sense possible, burned, converted into lime, and dispersed across the mortar joints of an unknown number of other buildings throughout the city, buildings whose stonework, ironically, would contain no visible trace whatsoever connecting it back to its true point of origin. There's a specific kind of loss embedded in this part of the story that feels different from the loss of the quarried travertine blocks we discussed in the previous chapters. When a block of travertine was pried loose from the Colosseum and hauled off to become part of the Palazzo Venezia's outer wall, something real was certainly lost: the block's original context, its place within the specific architectural composition the Roman engineers had designed. But the stone itself survived, in a form that a sufficiently informed and attentive observer could still, in principle, trace back to its point of origin, examine, and study. The marble that went into the lime kilns experienced something closer to total erasure. There is no tracing it. There is no recovering it. There is no studying it, examining it, or ever again connecting any specific surviving piece of Renaissance or early modern mortar back to the specific decorative marble panel or sculptural element it had once been part of. It simply doesn't exist anymore, in any form that retains a meaningful connection to what it once was. This might be the most quietly devastating chapter in the entire story of the Colosseum's dismantling. More devastating, arguably, than even the dramatic collapse of the southern wall itself, because the earthquake at least left behind rubble that could be studied, cataloged, and in some cases eventually incorporated into modern restoration efforts. The lime kilns left behind nothing at all. They represent the one category of loss in this entire story that is permanent and complete, full stop. A piece of the ancient world converted so thoroughly into raw industrial material that it no longer carries any trace of its former identity, scattered invisibly through the mortar joints of buildings that most people walking past them today would never think to connect to the Colosseum at all. And yet, even here, in what might be the darkest chapter of this whole account, there's a detail worth holding on to that keeps this from being a story purely of loss and erasure. The very same practical, resource-driven mindset that led medieval and Renaissance Romans to burn ancient marble into lime. The belief that the needs of the living, working city took precedence over the preservation of an unused ancient ruin was, eventually, going to encounter a different way of thinking. A shift in attitude that would take root not through any sudden change in economic necessity, but through a change in how the Colosseum itself came to be understood, not simply as an old building full of useful raw material, but as sacred ground, worthy of protection precisely because of what people had come to believe once happened there. That shift finally arrived in the 18th century, and it proved decisive enough to permanently halt the centuries of quarrying and lime-burning we've spent the last several chapters tracing. That's where we're headed next. Every long story of slow, gradual decline eventually needs a turning point, and the story of the Colosseum's dismantling has one. A genuine, identifiable moment where the centuries-long pattern of quarrying, scavenging, and lime-burning we've traced across the previous several chapters finally came to an end, replaced by an entirely different institutional relationship to the building, one that treats it, for the first time in its post-imperial history, as something to be actively protected, rather than passively consumed. That turning point arrived in the 18th century, and the figure most closely associated with it is Pope Benedict XIV, who held the papacy from 1740 until his death in 1758. To understand why this particular pope, at this particular moment, finally intervened decisively where centuries of his predecessors had not, we need to understand a specific religious and cultural belief that had, by this point, become deeply attached to the Colosseum's identity. A belief that had been developing gradually over previous centuries, and that would ultimately provide the moral and institutional justification needed to finally end the plundering for good. That belief centers on the idea that the Colosseum served, during the period of its active use in antiquity, as a site of Christian martyrdom, a place where early Christians, persecuted under various Roman emperors for their refusal to participate in state-sanctioned pagan religious practices, were killed as public spectacle, potentially including through exposure to wild animals as part of the venations we discussed back in Chapter 3. This tradition had circulated in various forms throughout Rome's medieval and Renaissance history, gradually accumulating cultural and religious weight even as, somewhat ironically, the building associated with these martyrdoms was simultaneously being quarried for its stone by many of the same religious institutions that venerated the memory of the martyrs supposedly killed there. It's worth being honest about the historical complexity underlying this tradition, because it matters for understanding exactly what happened next. Modern historians examining the available ancient evidence have generally found the specific, detailed claims of large-scale Christian martyrdom occurring at the Colosseum harder to substantiate with the same level of confidence than the tradition itself often implies. The surviving ancient sources documenting Christian persecution under various Roman emperors are considerably less specific about exact locations than later medieval and early modern tradition would come to assume, and some modern historians have suggested other sites in Rome may have hosted a comparable or even greater share of actual documented persecution events. This is a contested area of historical scholarship, and resolving it isn't the job of this account. What matters for our purposes is not whether the tradition was historically precise in every detail, but that the tradition existed, that it carried real weight within 18th century Catholic religious culture, and that it ultimately provided Pope Benedict XIV with exactly the institutional and moral framework needed to take the decisive action his predecessors, for whatever reason, had never taken. In the year 1749, Pope Benedict XIV took a formal, consequential step. he officially consecrated the Colosseum as a sacred site specifically in memory of the Christian martyrs believed to have died there, installing a series of stations of the cross around the interior of the arena and effectively declaring the site holy ground under the Catholic Church's direct religious authority and protection. This act, whatever its underlying historical accuracy, had an immediate and transformative practical consequence for the building's physical fate. A site formally consecrated as sacred ground, associated directly with Christian martyrdom and placed under papal religious protection, was no longer available to be casually treated as a municipal quarry. The centuries-old practice of licensing stone extraction, lime burning, and general scavenging from the Colosseum's fabric, a practice that had, as we've traced across several previous chapters, been carried out with the tacit or explicit approval of the church and civic authorities for generations, became, virtually overnight, incompatible with the building's newly formalized religious status. There's a particular kind of historical irony here, one that echoes the earlier observation about St. Peter's Basilica being partly constructed from Colosseum stone. For roughly 2 centuries, the same religious and civic authorities who now, under Benedict XIV, moved to protect the Colosseum as consecrated sacred ground had themselves been among the primary institutional forces licensing and benefiting from its dismantling. The transformation wasn't a matter of some outside force finally overpowering a stubbornly destructive institution. It was, instead, the very same institution that had presided over centuries of quarrying, fundamentally changing its own relationship to the building, driven by a shift in religious and cultural meaning rather than by any change in the underlying economic pressures that had originally justified the extraction in the first place. It's worth asking, honestly, why this particular shift happened when it did, in the middle of the 18th century specifically, rather than earlier or later. Several converging factors likely played a role. Benedict XIV himself was, by most historical accounts, an unusually intellectually engaged and scholarly pope, deeply interested in questions of church history, scholarship, and institutional reform, more inclined than some of his predecessors to engage seriously with historical and antiquarian questions rather than treating them as purely practical, resource management matters. The 18th century more broadly was also a period during which European intellectual culture was undergoing significant change. The early stirrings of what would eventually develop into modern archaeology and a more systematic, scholarly interest in classical antiquity were beginning to take shape during this general era, part of the broader intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. Even as those currents coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with more traditional religious frameworks like the martyrdom tradition Benedict XIV was directly invoking. And practically speaking, by the mid-18th century, roughly 400 years after the original 1349 earthquake, the most valuable and easily accessible portions of the Colosseum stone had likely already been extracted across the preceding centuries of quarrying, meaning the remaining structure may simply have represented diminishing practical value to potential quarriers compared to what it had represented in the 15th and 16th centuries, making the formal protective intervention a comparatively easier and less economically costly decision than it might have been at an earlier point in the building's post-collapse history. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the practical effect of Benedict XIV's 1749 consecration proved durable. The systematic, licensed extraction of stone from the Colosseum that had continued in various forms across roughly 4 centuries came to an effective end. This doesn't mean the building was suddenly restored, or that all forms of neglect and minor damage instantly stopped. The Colosseum would continue to face various threats and challenges across the following decades and centuries, including further, smaller earthquakes, ongoing weathering, and the general challenges of maintaining an enormous ancient structure with the comparatively limited resources and technical understanding available even in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But the specific pattern we've spent the last several chapters tracing, organized, licensed, large-scale quarrying and lime burning, treating the building fundamentally as a raw material source rather than a structure worth preserving in its own right, effectively ended with Benedict XIV's intervention and did not resume in any comparable form afterward. The consecration also marked something else worth noting: the beginning of a slow, multi-generational shift in how the Colosseum was culturally understood, moving gradually away from its centuries-long identity as an ambient, half-forgotten feature of the urban landscape, fortress, workshop, quarry, source of raw material, and towards something closer to its modern identity as a protected monument, a symbol, and eventually a subject of serious scholarly and archaeological study. That shift would continue to develop and deepen across the 19th and 20th centuries as the emerging discipline of modern archaeology, along with new movements in historical preservation and eventually a globalized tourism industry, would each add further layers of protection, restoration, and renewed cultural significance to the building. That final stretch, how the Colosseum moved from its 18th century consecration to its modern status as one of the most visited and protected monuments on Earth, and what this whole history actually leaves us with when we stand in front of that lopsided silhouette today, is how this account closes. Stand, once more, where this story began, in front of the Colosseum, at that particular angle where the asymmetry becomes impossible to ignore, where one side rises in its full, towering, four-tiered classical grandeur, and the other stops abruptly, roughly half as high, its raw inner core exposed to the sky in a way its original builders never intended anyone to see. By now, hopefully, that broken silhouette no longer reads as simple, undifferentiated decay, the vague, general erosion that time inflicts on all old things equally. It reads, instead, as a kind of layered historical record, written directly into the stone itself, each layer corresponding to a specific chapter of everything we've walked through together. The seismic engineering the original Roman builders wove into the structure specifically to survive the unstable ground beneath it, the centuries of medieval neglect and gradual repurposing that followed the empire's collapse, the catastrophic 1349 earthquake that exploited a hidden weakness in the southern foundation and brought roughly a third of the outer ring down in what was likely a matter of seconds. The 4 subsequent centuries of licensed, systematic quarrying that carried a significant portion of the remaining stone away to become the walls of the Palazzo Venezia, and, per the historical record, a contributing source of material for the ongoing construction of St. Peter's Basilica. The thousands of small clamp extraction wounds still visible across the surviving surface, marking the patient, small-scale scavenging of the building's original 300 tons of structural ironwork. The marble, burned in kilns near or within the arena itself, converted permanently and irreversibly into the mortar of buildings whose connection to the Colosseum has been completely and untraceably erased. And finally, the 1749 consecration under Pope Benedict XIV that, for reasons rooted as much in religious meaning as in any change of practical circumstance, finally brought this centuries long process of dismantling to an end. What happened in the centuries following that consecration is, in its own way, a hopeful continuation of the story, even if it moves at a considerably slower and less dramatic pace than everything that came before it. Through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the Colosseum's relationship to Rome, and eventually to the wider world, continued evolving. Major archaeological excavation work carried out during the 19th century, and continuing intermittently across the 20th, gradually uncovered and stabilized the hypogeum, the underground network of tunnels and lift shafts beneath the arena floor that had been buried under centuries of accumulated debris and, at various points, deliberately filled in and repurposed for other uses during the building's long medieval life as a fortress and residential space. Restoration campaigns across the 20th and into the 21st century have worked to structurally stabilize the surviving portions of the building, address the ongoing challenges posed by pollution, tourism-related wear, and Rome's continuing, if now much better monitored and managed, seismic vulnerability, and, in recent decades, to reconstruct portions of the arena floor itself, allowing modern visitors to walk across a partial recreation of the original wooden surface, looking down into the hypogeum's exposed maze of chambers and shafts in a way that would have been completely invisible to any spectator attending an actual event in antiquity, when that entire underground mechanism was meant to remain hidden. Today, the Colosseum stands as one of the most visited monuments on the entire planet, drawing something in the range of 6 to 7 million visitors annually in recent pre-pandemic years, according to figures reported by Italian cultural heritage authorities. a level of ongoing public fascination that would likely have astonished the medieval Romans who once quarried its stone for their churches and palaces, viewing the building as an unremarkable, if conveniently located, source of raw material rather than a destination worth traveling continents to see. It has become, in the accumulated cultural imagination of the modern world, something closer to a universal symbol, not merely of ancient Rome specifically, but of the entire concept of a vanished, monumental past, instantly recognizable even to people with only the vaguest understanding of the actual history embedded in its walls. And yet, precisely because of that instant recognizability, precisely because the Colosseum has become such a fixed, familiar image, appearing on postcards, in films, on the reverse of the Italian 5-cent euro coin, in the backgrounds of a near-infinite number of tourist photographs, it's worth pausing, deliberately, on the specific asymmetry that started this whole account, because that broken silhouette carries an insight buried within it, one that's easy to miss if you only ever encounter the building as a flattened, familiar image rather than an actual physical object with an actual, complicated history. The insight is this: the version of the Colosseum still standing today is not a ruin in any passive sense. It is not simply what happened to a building left alone with time. It is, instead, the specific, particular, negotiated outcome of an enormously long argument, conducted across roughly 2,000 years, between multiple different generations and multiple different sets of values, about what this structure was actually for. The Roman engineers who built it argued, through their seismic reinforcement system, that it should survive. The medieval Romans who repurposed its arches into workshops and fortified compounds argued, through their actions, that it should serve the practical needs of a struggling, shrinking city. The Renaissance popes and cardinals who licensed its quarrying argued, through their building campaigns, that its stone belonged to the living city's ongoing construction, not to the frozen preservation of a pagan past. And Pope Benedict XIV, in 1749, argued something different from every one of his predecessors, that this particular structure, specifically because of what people had come to believe happened within its walls, deserved protection not despite its age and its lost original purpose, but because of the sacred meaning that had, over the centuries, attached itself to that very loss. Every one of these arguments left a physical mark on the building that's still visible today, if you know how to read it. The lopsided silhouette isn't a wound that time simply inflicted and never healed. It's closer to scar tissue built from centuries of different civilizations, each with its own values, each making a real, consequential decision about what to do with an enormous, difficult, expensive, magnificent structure they inherited from people whose world had already vanished by the time they had to decide what to do with what was left behind. That's a strange kind of inheritance to sit with, and it's worth returning, one final time, to the image that opened this entire account. A visitor standing at that particular angle, in that particular Roman evening light, noticing for the first time that one side of the building rises whole and the other does not. What that visitor is actually looking at, once you understand the full history behind it, is not simply an old building that fell into disrepair. It's a physical record of an ongoing, multi-century negotiation about memory, value, and use, a negotiation that, in its own quiet way, is still happening today, every time a restoration team decides how much of the modern arena floor to rebuild, every time a conservation authority weighs the competing demands of preservation against the practical realities of hosting 7 million annual visitors, every time a new generation looks at this ancient, broken, still standing structure and has to decide, once again, exactly what it owes to something this old, this damaged, and this impossible to fully recover. The missing half of the Colosseum, in the end, is not really a story about absence at all. It's a story about exactly how much can survive, how much can actually make it through 2,000 years of earthquakes, empires, plagues, blacksmiths, quarry licenses, lime kills, and eventual, hard-won protection, when enough people, across enough generations, ultimately decide that some things are worth the trouble of keeping standing, even in a shape their original builders never intended, even carrying wounds their original builders could never have imagined, and even only half as whole as they once were. If this kind of slow, layered history is the kind of thing that helps your mind unwind at the end of the day, consider staying with the Sleepy Archive a little longer. There's a whole channel of stories like this one waiting for you. Quiet, patient, and built to help you drift off exactly the way this one, hopefully, has started to do. The past, told slowly. See you in the next one.